continue to keep Reverend Rayson,
Amen.
mother and father of the church, all of those that are sick and shut in, Lord, they couldn't be here today. Let's keep them all in our prayers.
Yes,
And
amen.
yeah, talked to her yesterday, and she was coughing, and her voice sounded like she was gargling with razor blade. So let's continue to keep her in our prayers.
Amen.
Hopefully she'll be back next week. Lesson 6,
Amen.
the boy Jesus. Wow. Boy Jesus. That's some pretty good reading there.
All right.
And something that I had discovered while I'm studying up with this lesson, you know, there isn't much in the Bible that talks about Jesus when he was young. Luke has some of it, and there are a few others. But a lot of the other lessons and the other verses and all the different books talk about it when he was a young man. But this is pretty interesting. And the lesson here today goes back, I remember the one before the COVID situation there. So they all complement each other. You know, we've all raised kids, and to share this with you one day, I was washing dishes and my oldest was getting ready to go to school. And as I was looking out the window as he passed by, I had just noticed that he shot up like a, you know, he just grown up real fast. And you know, you see him every day, but when you know, you sit down and think about it and look at it in a different way, it sort of startles you.
Amen.
You know, when he came back in the afternoon, I said, man, standing next to me, he was looking me right in my eyes. You know, then we have situations like that, but in this, we're going to see that Mary and Joseph is going to be startled to find out how much wisdom that this young man had. How he'd sit with elders, teachers, rabbis, and all.
Right.
Like, wow, where does he come up with these questions? How is he answering this type of stuff? So wisdom, which we've been discussing here the past few weeks. Now, the Gospel of Luke provides a comprehensive picture of Jesus' ministries. And with about 1/3 of the material that's included in the Gospel of Luke only appearing in this account, that Luke focuses on Jesus as the Son of Man, the promised Messiah, beginning with the birth announcements of John the Baptist and Jesus. Luke provides multiple indicators of Jesus' divine nature by revealing his true humanity. When Mary and Joseph went to present Jesus in the temple, the elderly Simeon was led there by the Spirit. He saw Jesus, took him up in his arms, O Messiah, and saying, Mary pondered these things she witnessed in her heart. Now in the Old Testament, there are many prophecies that spoke about God's promise to bring us Messiah. And in the past few weeks in the earlier lessons, we've seen God's words fulfilled exactly how it said it would happen. When we studied the birth of Jesus, when Mary and Joseph obeyed God's law by dedicating Jesus at the temple when he was only 8 years old. Simeon and Anna recognized that he was the Messiah and God had promised. So today, we're going to study another event in Jesus' life when he was young. And the Bible is not filled, as I mentioned before, with a lot of stories about Jesus as a boy or in his childhood. But God has given us at least a limited view of Jesus before he began his ministry as the Son of God. But what God does reveal to us, he teaches us that Jesus is God's Son. Now, most parents have a consuming interest in the development of their children. They also have a natural desire to protect them from all sorts of harm. Joseph and Mary felt this way about their unusual son, as evidenced by this week's lesson. Although frightened by a 3-day separation, And amazed by Jesus' interaction with the temple scholars, they settled down in their home in Nazareth and watched him mature mentally, physically, spiritually, and socially. A little background lesson that we'll get right into it. First two verses of our lesson comes from the book of Ecclesiastes. As you study, you see that there's two different sets of verses in there from two different books. The first is from Ecclesiastes. The word Ecclesiastes is a form of Hebrew, a word called kohelet. It implies that the author is a teacher or preacher. Now Solomon is considered to be the author of the book, written sometime during his long 40-year reign as king. And the second verse, the underlying theme of the book of Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, what it's saying there, eloquently summarizes the underlying theme of the book. Now, that all human achievements are empty and disappointing when pursued as ends in themselves. But in the book of Solomon reflects on many of his experiences which agree with his name, vanities. Now Solomon's purpose of writing the book was to show that emptiness is the final result of all without God within your life. And a portion of this book is in our text that we're going to study today, that Solomon states that there is a time for everything and everything has its purpose. If I could get someone to read A Time for Everything, Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, verse 1, and verse 7b in Luke, second chapter, verse 39 and 40.
There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be silent and a time to speak. When Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. And the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him.
Let's expand a little bit to these verses, so you can better understand it. To everything there is a season and a time, every purpose under the heaven. As I was studying this for this lesson, I recall a song back in the 60s called Turn, Turn, Turn. This is the first verse in that song, back in the early 60s. It just dawned on me when I read that. But the word season here means an appointed or fixed time over which God maintains absolute control. The word time also indicates something that is a portion, appointed, or proper. Now, both words suggest a duration of time in which opportunity exists to accomplish a specific task. But that time does not last forever. The term purpose signifies a delight, a wish, or a desire. In the context of this verse, purpose emphasizes an activity that excites a person's interest and becomes the focus of his or her pursuits. The very mention of purpose presupposes that there is a purpose or a purposer. A purposer. Solomon, who's credited with writing Ecclesiastes, said, to everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven. In essence, Solomon is saying there is a season and appointed time for everything and for every delight and event or purpose under the heaven. So the point of the verse seems to be that it is composed of cycles that we as human beings can't change. We can't change. Some of the things, birth, death, and other things that take place in your life where we all learn certain things. Recall there, our lesson, the main word within the lesson is wisdom. So there are learned things that we all get out of these different things that we go through in life. So at some time, all of these emotions will occur, and no situation in our life is permanent. So we should look to God with the expectations and hope in every situation that we go through in our life. A time to keep silent. This is the next verse. A time to speak. Now the phrase is the second part of verse 7. The first part says that there's a time to rend or tear, and a time to sow or repair. This has to do with the fact that there is a time when relationships can be broken. But there's also a time to repair those relationships. Now, since God controls everything, He controls the course of our human relationships. Now, that wisdom that we gain has a lot to do with our relationships. To go back and say there's a time to speak, but also the wisdom told us there's certain things that you can say and probably certain things that you can't say. That's the wisdom of knowing those that we have relationships with. Now for everything it says there's a season or an appointed time. Now since there's a time for everything, even our various relationships, God has ordained a time to keep silent, as I just mentioned, and a time to speak. So this tells us that another area of God's sovereignty in relationships concern, I know y'all heard it, I know the pastor had preached on this, the tongue. Or it could be dangerous. Could be dangerous. Tongue. Silence can be tactful, but sometimes plain speech is necessary. How do you reflect your feelings? What you say? It takes much wisdom to be able to know which of these times is proper for that particular moment. Now, a little bit of the background into the second part of these verses, because we're changing books going into Luke now. This portion focuses on Jesus' early life. After Jesus' birth, it's believed that Joseph and Mary remained in Bethlehem for up to 2 years. 40 days after Jesus was born, fulfilling the purification requirements of Leviticus, Mary and Joseph traveled to the temple in Jerusalem to present him before God. That explains that in Leviticus also, which confirms that Jesus was presented in the temple for his circumcision, not after 8 days, but 40 days. Now the trip from Bethlehem to Jerusalem was about 6 miles long. And it was during their visit to Jerusalem that a priest named Simeon prophesied by Jesus. Prophesied that Jesus' mission in life, and he blessed both of the parents. Now, before Mary and Joseph left to the temple to return home, a woman by the name, she was a widow by the name of Anna. She's a prophetess who lived in the house of God and blessed Bethlehem and Jesus' family when they took their long journey back. The journey from Bethlehem to Egypt was about 40 miles when they went there at that time. And this was well after Herod died. Mary and the family's trip to and back from Egypt there fulfilled the Bible's prophecy that they would take their trip. So now, he's a little bit older. Jesus was a little bit older. And they're starting to take these trips, especially when they have large feasts. You know, we just finished talking about Bible study, some of those feasts there with the leavened bread and all. And so they are fulfilling what they should be doing throughout their life now. Here, in Luke 2nd chapter, verses 39 to 42, and when they had performed all things according to the law of the Lord, and they returned into Galilee to their own city Nazareth. Now this phrase, and when they performed all things according to the law of the Lord, excuse me, refers to the fulfillment of Jesus' circumcision and the law of purification for his mother Mary, which means it was given the law of the Lord. Now when Jesus' parents completed those ceremonies, they returned into Galilee to their own city Nazareth. Now within Luke, in this chapter, it appears that there were some parts of Jesus' life that was omitted because it skips. It skips. Now, he was 40 days old, but it would go further until when he was a teenager. Now, they continued when they had returned back to Bethlehem, because they were commanded to flee into Egypt and escape the anger and the rage of Herod. Now, while in Egypt, when they did go down there, they were told that Herod was dead. So they were instructed to return to their home in Nazareth. This is what Luke meant when he wrote, they returned into Galilee to their own city, Nazareth. It's referred to their own city because Mary and Joseph were from Nazareth, which was in the northern province of Galilee. The next verse, and the child grew. Now, this is where it shows that there's a skip. Being 40 days, and now young teenager. And the child grew and waxed strong in spirit, fulfilled with the wisdom and the grace of God was upon him. Now, just like any other kids, you know, they grow up bodily in stature, but unlike other children who may be weak in understanding and resolution, Jesus waxed or grew strong in spirit. It seems to me that the Spirit of God, Jesus, or a human soul, was full of extraordinary vigor. He had a lot of energy. He was always into things. And of course, as you're growing through that time, you also gain wisdom. Even as a child, Jesus' reasoning was strong and his judgment was right, as we shall see later on in the text now. Solomon declared that foolishness is bound in the heart of a child. He means that they're not crazy or they're not doing things wrong. Kids are going to play. Okay. He went out, he had friends. In fact, they lived around a bunch of other relatives. Joseph had relatives, Mary had relatives that were there, and they had kids also. So we did have relationships. But out of each and every group, you notice that there's one person that always a cut above. This was Jesus. Now, he didn't have advanced education, but because the presence of the Holy Spirit was with him, put him there cut above the others. Having early observed the godliness of Joseph and Mary, so we can safely assume that they had instructed their entire family in the scriptures and in the law of Moses, where Jewish fathers were commanded to teach their kids the ways of God. The scriptures were taught regularly in the synagogues, and the part of the verse says that, and the grace of God was upon him. In other words, Jesus had the favor of God upon him and was loved by God, who took special care of him. Why would he not? I mean, this is the son. This is the son. So, we're moving right along here. If I get someone to read a commendable attitude.
Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to the custom. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. But they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you."
Now here, in these passages, Luke singled out a certain event in the young life of Jesus to demonstrate that he understood his divine mission. Now, when they took the trek, that family didn't go alone, and there were others that were with them, as I mentioned before, that they had relatives. And all of them went to these feasts together. Now, while they were traveling, of course, Jesus was not directly by their side. You'll see here, explain the rest of these verses, that Mary and Joseph thought that he was straggling, hanging out with a few of his other relatives, his cousins and all. But to their chagrin, they come to find out that he wasn't there at all. What parent wouldn't start getting nervous, like, well, where's my baby?
Yeah.
That's going to happen. So when it says there, when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast. Now, the custom of the feast refers to the law that commanded all males to attend 3 main feasts. Now, for the first 12 years of a Jewish boy's life, where he was represented at the festival by his father, but at age 13, he became a son of the law. That's like nowadays, when they say that you're 18, you're considered an adult. There's some lawmakers today trying to change that and make it 16. But as we take a look at how we evolve in our lives, being 16, back about 100 years ago, you had the responsibilities of a normal adult would have. But as things get modernized, that's where we in our own selves, the society changes. But here is when he turned 13. That's why they call it son of the law. Or son of the law is also called the covenant. And he had to fulfill duties that he, as a boy of 13 years old, had to take care of himself. Now sometimes boys are comforted by their fathers for a year or two before this. So when Jesus attended the feast, when he was 12 years old, they had prepared him for what to expect when he returned when he was 13. Verse 43, and when they had fulfilled these and they returned, The child Jesus tarried behind in Jerusalem, and Joseph and his mother knew not of it. They didn't know that he was still, he went back. And when they fulfilled the days refers to the week-long celebration of the Passover. This expression also implies that Joseph and Mary remained in Jerusalem for the entire feast, of the unleavened bread, or Passover, which lasted for 7 days. Now, unlike some who only stayed for the day of the Passover, they stayed there the whole thing. But once the feast of the unleavened bread was over, as they returned, the child Jesus tarried behind in Jerusalem. That means he remained. He had a mission. Now, when his father took him when he was at the age of 12, as I mentioned earlier, it was preparing him for when he turned 13. He was a son of the law. And you'll see that he's going to go on his own. When Joseph and Mary began to search for Jesus, they went back, searching for 3 days, and they found him in the temple. Now, these 3 days here mentioned most likely refer to the total time that passed since they had originally left Jerusalem. But 1 day traveling with the caravan, the 2nd day returning to Jerusalem, the 3rd day they found him. We may think that the search was an arduous one. Of course, apparently, yeah, it would be. But it may not have been since the feast was over and the crowds would have greatly decreased. Now, the last time his parents had saw Jesus, he was in the temple, so they went there and they found him in the temple. So they knew that he had an interest in the temple while he was there with them. So he goes back by himself. When they went there, they found him sitting in the midst of doctors, lawmakers, other religious leaders. And he was hearing what those teachers were relaying to him. And then he started to ask them questions. Here's where his wisdom really comes out for a 13-year-old. Jesus is seen here not as a teacher, but a listener, a learner, a questioner, and a discusser, based on the fact that he was deity. And there would seem to be no need for this at that time. But he's taking it all in. Now, as we know that as he was coming up, that he was taking all of this wisdom and everything in. And when Jesus taught, and this is why I think he first picked it up in my readings, when he taught in parables. In the education side, we call those analogies. It gives you an example where that you can be able to draw the picture in your mind of what he's saying. Some of those parables were in questions. Now, he was pretty slick where when someone would ask him a question, he'd answer with a question. And the reason why he answered with a question is because he knew that the person that asked the question knew the answer. And the answer would come from there. So, and all that heard him were astonished in his questioning and his discussion. They were astonished at his understanding and his answers. All that heard him were astonished in his answers. There was being the word astonished is a strong term indicating that everyone present who was listening to Jesus was beside themselves with amazement. Never encountered anyone like him for his age. They were amazed at his understanding, which implies he had keen comprehension or insight. Now, let's discuss that comprehension or insight. I'm talking to you, but are you understanding? Hearing and comprehending is two different things. Okay? Hearing means that your sense of hearing is working. But is it calculating up into the gray matter, what I'm saying? His was calculating, but not the same at the age of someone that was 13 years old usually. So, note that later on in life, that Jesus was divine. He revealed in the constant development and the use of his mind. But unlike Jesus, we have the advantage of having minds that are limited. And the reason why our minds are limited is because we are all sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. They were the first sinners. We brought that with us. Jesus was pure. So the same things that we pick up within our life has a tendency to make us reason different. Verse 48, and when they saw him, they were amazed. And his mother said unto him, Son, why hast thou dealt us? Behold, thy father and I have sought thee. Sorry. And when it says they, they're referring to his parents. When they saw him, they were amazed. The word amazed here means astonished. Amazed implies of being stricken out of one's senses. Jesus' parents were shocked not to much of the things that Jesus was saying, but to the fact that they were amongst teachers, and he was basically out teaching the teachers. Just out teaching the teachers. Okay. Try and get someone to read a continual learning. It's Luke chapter 29, verses 49 through 52.
Why were you searching for me? He asked. Did you know I had to be in my Father's house? But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man.
All right. Now the verse says, and he went unto them. How is it that ye sought me? Wist ye not that I must be about my Father's business? Now which father are we talking about? We're talking about Joseph?
No, Heavenly Father.
Talking about Heavenly Father. Now, at the age of 13, 12, yes, he worked with his father, Joseph. Joseph was a carpenter. And Jesus was a carpenter. Of course, he was talking about his other father. That's why he went back to the temple. Now, Jesus' answer to his mother was first recorded, stated in the scripture, that he actually spoke. The first recording of him speaking. And his answering his mother. That's in Luke. And it set him apart from his Nazareth family. But Mary and Joseph were so astonished at the finding in the temple. He seemed just as astonished as they had been looking for him. He didn't think that they should have to look for him because he's in his father's house. He was well taken care of. Now it appears that Jesus was completely aware of his divine identity and mission. But he's asking why they didn't know where he had been in his father's house. It was unthinkable to Jesus that his parents didn't understand his proper place. but it was not yet obvious to them. Now Mary had called Joseph Jesus' father, whereas Jesus' divine consciousness showed him that his true father was God. And that he must obey. That's an early calling there. Very early calling. And Jesus asserted, I must be about my Father's business, with the word business being translated in many other verses. Different Bibles, they call it the house. He was about his divine business. And they understood not the saying which he spake unto them. Now it may have been a surprise that Jesus' parents didn't understand what he was saying to them at that time. One would think that Joseph and Mary should not have been surprised to find Jesus where he was. And after all, they knew of his divine origin. But this truth was easily hidden in the first 12 years of his everyday life. But them, well, they knew that he was special. Growing up as a child, going out to play, helping his father's work, doing different things, holding activities and all, then all of a sudden, a big change at the age of 13. Excuse me. They become astonished to caring for Jesus' needs and seeing him develop as a normal boy. But this event hit them like a bolt of lightning out of the blue sky. They did not understand what business he had to do in the temple for his father. They believed that he was to be the Messiah and would sit at the throne of his father. But they probably also thought that this should have brought him back to the temple. Which is why he went back there. And when they went down with him and came to Nazareth, and he was subject unto them, but his mother kept all of these things in her heart. Now, despite Jesus' heightened awareness of his divine sonship, he went down to them with his parents and came to Nazareth and was subject unto them. The words "he went down with them" means that Jesus had left Jerusalem with his parents and went back down to Nazareth. Jerusalem was situated about 25, it's like maybe 2,500 foot hill. That was a landmark that they used to know how to get there. Now, the son of Jesus, the Son of God, Jesus had submitted to his parents, and was suddenly an act of self-sacrifice when he went back to the temple. When he went back. And where it says that he was subject to them, he observed that their position of authority. You remember, he knew that they were his parents and that he had to respect them and obey them. And went back as they directed him to. So they went back and they got him and they took him back with them. But they're thinking the whole time that his divinity is coming out. But his mother kept all these things saying in her heart. This means that Mary did not perfectly or completely understand what her son was saying, or his words yet. She kept them in her heart. Saying that it probably meant that there's an expectation that sometime in the future his words would be explained to her and she would fully understand them and know how to use them. Now, she's got to learn her son again. As we're growing up, we have relationships. She's going to have a different relationship with her son here because it's changing. And now in this final verse here, 52, and Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. So that would have been about 18 more years. There's another skip inside Luke. 18 more years would pass before Jesus would begin his public ministry. Now, all we know about those 18 years is just about contained in this verse. Since Joseph is not mentioned again, and I had to do a little bit more searching on this, Joseph didn't mention after this verse. So it's a good possibility maybe he had passed it on. So 18 years in between that, and Joseph already had some age on him when Jesus was born. Now, so he might have died. Now, if this was the case, then Jesus would have become responsible for the support of the family. Now, also here, Luke focuses that the virtues that Jesus developed during these silent years between 12 and 30 years old. He increased or matured in wisdom, or mentally, in stature, or physically. And in favor with God, meaning spiritually, Jesus also increased in favor with man also. He matured socially. Now, even though Jesus was perfect in every stage of his life, he experienced growth in these areas because he was also human. And when he reached adulthood, he was perfectly fitted for the unique task of this teaching he had beforehand. Now, I'll be 65 in May, but I still have some things to learn. We should never stop growing in wisdom. Never ever stop growing in wisdom. We can learn if we continue to go to the Father's house. Where Jesus started to develop a lot more wisdom. As you recall in the first verse, in Ecclesiastes we read that there's a time for everything. An allotted time. But if you take a look at your lifespan, that time for gaining wisdom is your entire life. You can't shut things out because you're part of it. What is required when we want to grow in wisdom is paying close attention to those around us who we're trying to share, what we're trying to share with those that are around us. And it's wise to do that. We need to comprehend what we hear. I mean, carefully, don't just hear it. God's word, at times, can be sort of tricky for us. That's why we go and translate what's taking place here in the verses. The Bible has some good reading in it and has some good stories in it. And for each and every story that is in there, there's a reason behind it. And I say all the time that there is nothing that takes place today that hasn't already taken place and explained in the Bible. Nothing new. Nothing new. But God's word is always consistent. He was wise. He lived in, and he's still living now. So we need to continue to go to his house.
Amen.
Questions, comments, reactions, observations,